My entire life, my father's always been a piece of work. Every single day, we had to struggle, me and my mom, because of the way my father treated us, and it does not get any different once I get a fiancé. And guys, you will not believe what my father said to him. They say you never know what you have till you've lost it. That was the exact case with my father. My childhood memory is one filled with a loving mom and a deadbeat dad. My parents were not wealthy, but we were above the poverty class. I guess that's something to be grateful for. My mother was a school teacher at a popular high school in our area, and she was really greatly loved by virtually everyone who she came across. She was all beauty and brain. Parents found it easy trusting her with their children. Mom was the only reason to be grateful, as I've lost count of the amount of times that I enjoyed certain favors from people I never knew simply because I was the daughter of Miss Alice. My father, if he ever has been the cause of every heartache I've ever known in my life. While fatherless children wish for fathers, I wish to be fatherless. While single ladies desperately sought husbands, my mom regretted being married to one. My father was a jerk in every sense of the word. He worked in a waste disposal company as the driver, and even though the pay was not really high, it could have made life much more better for us if he only utilized it better. But that was a no for him. He was selfish and self-centered, and as a result, he always put his pleasure and consideration first before the needs of his family. We were never even put into consideration. There was really no difference between him and the waste that he disposed. I mean, why get married and start up a family if you never really are ready or even trying to be responsible? He would lavish his money at the bar, buying drinks for his friends and lovers, but he would hardly give my mom a dime to cook, or much less take care of herself and me. There was always one sorry tale or the other of how he was either robbed or how he helped someone who was greatly in need. Mom wasn't stupid. She had seen and heard things, and so, well, she was aware of his escapades. Thanks to my dad, I don't have someone that I could call a brother or sister, as Mom had to avoid unprotected sex with him at all cost to keep herself from getting infected with sexually transmitted diseases, which, looking back now, I wish Dad had caught one. Mom simply turned a blind eye to her husband's misdemeanor, and that was the only reason why we had peace. Mom had been scorned, and she bore grief and anger, which were bottled up on the inside. Who wouldn't? And, well, so hell broke loose at our home one evening when Dad decided to bring his stupidity home. He always knew just how to make Mom mad. He came back home with one of his mistresses, and when my mother, who felt disrespected, demanded the lady left the house, my dad, who was visibly intoxicated with alcohol, you could smell it from his breath a mile away, slapped my mother. To start with, this was the very house that my mother was single-handedly paying the rent, feeding and housing my father without any input whatsoever from him. How and why would someone call somebody like that a husband? I still can't understand. That day, my father discovered that he married a lioness, as a fight ensued between both of them, and immediately, Mom returned the slap. My father's lover fled the scene as the neighbors came to separate the fight. Mom was beaten up by her husband, who was under the influence of alcohol. No doubt, though, she scarred his face for life with a knife that narrowly missed his eyeball. Mom decided that she's had enough. She was going to get a divorce, at least for the peace of mind and safety of both of us. This was a good move on her part, but it's a shame that it had to take her being beaten up by my father to come to that realization. The divorce proceedings was a very easy one, and Mom got custody of me, as she could readily prove to the court that my father was incapable of taking care of himself, much less raising a family. While you could see it as a win for my mom, my dad saw it as a win for himself. Although the court ordered him to pay $1,000 in child support monthly, he saw himself as being finally free from us. So much for a dad. Every time when I look back, I get filled with so much disgust that the only time I could profit from my dad's money was when the court mandated him to do so. It would seem as though he was the one being liberated, but the reverse was definitely the case. Mom was actually the one who was set free from the shame and embarrassment he brought. It was now a lesser mouth for her to feed, as she practically fed and chartered for the three of us. Dad was just a figurehead. Mom and I lived very well. I was 12 years old at the time, and the financial demands were not so much as they would be in a few years' time. So we were living a much more comfortable life than we did when Dad was with us. What a relief it was. If only Mom had known earlier that her husband was rubbish. She needed to get rid of him in order to live well. Men began flocking around my mother. She was 38 years old and still retained her beauty. She surprisingly turned them down, as most came for pleasure, and besides, she had just been through a divorce, so she needs time to heal, not rush into a fresh relationship that could end up hurting her. The same could not be said for my father. His story was all over the place. He was all over everywhere. He puts in every effort to live the, quote, good life. Well, he was building a false reputation among the company of friends that he kept, mostly drunks who treated their families the way he treated us. So he always needed money to sustain the lie he was living. This was difficult for him, as he now had to feed himself and pay his rent, something Mom always did, and that was just part of the problem. He still needed to make his child support payment monthly. This made him resort to leeching onto women, whether they were single or married. He moved in and out of homes of these women. That was his strategy for survival. Even though my father was not restricted from seeing me, he never did, not once. How could he, when he was busy living the good life, as he put it? We were people from his past that he did not want to have anything to do with. I clearly got the message when I gained admission into college shortly after my 19th birthday. It'd been a year since he's last sent money to us, and that was because I turned 18. He was no longer required to pay the child support by court. He considered the money given for the well-being of his daughter a levy. I guess he must have anxiously looked forward to the day that I would turn 18, and he could finally sever any form of ties bonding him to us. Ever since he stopped sending money, Mom did her best to provide for herself and I. I was no longer a toddler, so the cost of living grew increasingly difficult. There were nights when we went to bed without food. Bills, well, they were piling up, and when I decided to get a job, I received my letter of admission to college. My mom and I pondered how we could meet up with the college expenses, which was going to be something else. I suggested letting go the admission and maybe just reapplying next year. This was so that I could get a job and save for school, but my mother, who was a teacher and knew the value of education, vehemently refused, as though she had another option. I finally thought it best to reach out to my father. Perhaps he may prove reasonable and could decide to lend a hand. It was clear from the dead expression on my mother's face that she knew every effort made to reach my dad and probably get help from him would end up with me being frustrated. But she did not stop me from doing so. I wish she had. As expected, it was difficult finding my dad. The waste disposal company where he worked told me he had parted ways with them a long time ago, and they had no idea of his whereabouts. Sorry. His work as a garbage truck driver would definitely not match the rich profile he was claiming to possess. It took a while, but Mom finally got word from a fellow teacher in her school of my father's whereabouts. I was directed to a water bottling company with the expectation that my father would be one of the workers, but my greatest surprise, he turned out to be the manager. It was both shocking and hilarious to my mother when she heard me say that my father, who had no educational qualifications to manage that company, was actually sitting at the helm of affairs. This man never ceased to amaze us. We got to discover that the owner of the company was a widow whom my father was sleeping with. She was the one currently footing his bills, and although my mother was shocked to learn of his fortune, she was not the least bit surprised at the outcome of my meeting with him. Even if he had millions, the hatred he felt towards my mother would not allow him to help his own daughter. What a fool. I got into his office simply because he wanted me to see how he was doing really great. That way, my mother would be just jealous of her loss when she heard of it, but bluntly denied me help. I'd barely began telling him about my need for assistance when he cut me short. He felt irritated by my presence. I stood behind him with my boiling in rage as I listened to him talk about having done enough for me by ensuring that I lacked nothing before turning 18, and I was a woman by every standards, which meant that I ought to take care of myself just as every other woman does. The tears I began shedding in his office did not stop him from telling me that the last child support fee he paid before I turned 18 was the last money or support that I and my mother would ever get from him as long as he lived. I never bothered to ask my mom about my father's upbringing. Was he treating me this way because his father did same, or what? Why should parents let the rivalry come between them and their children? My father literally used me as an object of vengeance towards my mother. He knew my tears would provoke hers too, and he was right. It did. My mom and I were broken for days, but we moved on. I finally decided that I was going to give him the distance he so desired. I was sure my father was dead to me. I go into college a few weeks later, after my mom rallied around to raise funds from some friends. Some loan it took her, while others asked her not to pay a dime back. The money was just enough to get me started, but I soon had needs that needed to be met. My mom was drained in several ways. She had lost her beauty, she'd lost her spark. The little salary she earned went to my schooling, so there was nothing left for her to take care of herself. I was left with the option of getting a job and making sure that my mother never found out. There was an opening for a waitress in a restaurant around my college, and I quickly applied. Students were the main customers that patronized that eatery, as it was suited in a schooling environment. The work took much of my time. I could barely do anything with the little time left, as I was always exhausted. I understood why my mother had warned me against getting a side job as a student, especially as a freshman, when my grades began dropping. But quitting the job was not an option for me. How else would a fatherless girl with not so capable mother survive on campus? I had worked in the restaurant for just 3 months when I first crossed paths with Nathan. Nathan was my senior in age, class, wealth, and all. His father owned about 6 gas stations, and from the treat he gave to his friends who accompanied him to the restaurant, I could tell that he was not in supply of cash. That, however, was not what caught my attention. Nathan was tall, fair, and handsomely blonde, something every lady, including myself, could call their dream. The way he carried himself with such charisma really appealed to me. As expected, such guys were not in short supply of ladies. Among his company of friends that day were 2 girls who were seated by his side, almost worshipping him. Even though he was in the midst of friends and probably lovers, Nathan would occasionally shoot glances at me. I know this because his gaze always caught mine. His visits to the restaurant became more frequent, and so he began seeking my attention. I must confess that I had long hoped he would make a move, but when he finally did, I had to play the usual hard to get. We ladies do, and I'm grateful he persisted. We soon began seeing each other, and Nathan became everything to me. Well, besides my mother, at least. He was my friend, my brother, my lover, my father. He was very thoughtful and intentional about helping me. I quit the job at the restaurant, but rather than suffer lack, I was comfortable than I've had been in my life. Try dating a millionaire's son who loves you to bits, and you might understand just what I mean. I knew there was no point hiding Nathan from my mom, otherwise she would keep sending money, which she could use to take care of herself. She had to know that I was comfortable in school. I took Nathan to go see Mom, and he soon became her husband too. He often supported her in the little ways that he could. Nathan wasn't really the brightest of students. I had to push him to study at times, but he sure had a heart of gold, and good grades too. How he got those were his business. He was in his final year, and getting a job was not going to be an issue once he graduated. We got engaged once he graduated, and he began managing one of his father's gas stations. Mom had begun dating again some months after I graduated from college, and her birthday was around the corner, so Nathan suggested we threw her a surprise birthday party. I readily welcomed the idea, as I could not recall my mom celebrating her birthday all through my years. She needed a joy booster of all the pains and heartaches she had gone through at the hands of my father. The day finally came when Mom turned 42. I still remember the joyful expressions Mom wore that day. Just seeing her light up brought tears to my eyes. She'd spent her whole life caring for the needs of others, to the point that she neglected her own needs. I was glad that her spark had returned. The day was going well until Dad showed up uninvited. He was looking messed up, clear signs that life had turned against him. This man was a joy killer, not minding the fact that he was unwelcome there. He began giving tales of him coming to wish my mom well and equally making peace. How disgusting. He suddenly became a peacemaker, someone who never bought her so much as a cake on her birthday, whom I've never heard wishing her a happy birthday throughout the years we lived together, now wanted to facilitate my mom. Such a hypocrite. The mere sight of him brought out anger in me that I never knew existed. I created a scene as I demanded he left our house. Whatever his reason was for coming around here, it was selfish. As we would later learn, he apparently had an issue with the lover whose business he managed. He cheated on her with several other ladies along the side, as he used her for money, which he siphoned to sponsor his escapades. She had the police lock him up for a while, and when he was released, he desperately needed help. And that was when he decided to show up here. How he got wind of the fact that things were going great in our favor, I still cannot tell you, and I honestly don't care. The people from his past whom he never wanted associations with now became all too important to him. My mother never said a word. She acted like he was not even physically present. She just gracefully walked past him so he could see that she turned out all right, before demanding that the stranger was kicked out of the house. It was epic. Dad was thrown out of the house, but that was the beginning of some disturbances from him. He soon began making it a practice to show up. When he was not knocking, he was calling. And when he was not calling, he was texting to ask for money. How he got our numbers, I cannot tell you. It was more like he was stalking our every moves. Apparently, his business of conning single and married women was no longer booming. I mean, he was in his 50s and losing both his touch and looks. So it was going to be difficult finding a woman who was willing to sponsor his excess. Single ladies were mainly hunted for loaded mature men who would take care of their expenses, while mature single ladies equally needed someone ready for marriage, who equally brought something to the table, and not let them bear the full weight of family responsibilities alone. These were things that my father lacked: the will and ability to take one responsibility. Besides, he messed up his name in the city, and we would rather lose our necks before we let his shame rub off on us. It was his guts for me, expecting to waltz back into our lives after all these years and act like nothing ever happened. When he saw that we were not giving him any bit of attention, he became rather desperate and frustrated. He tried getting to my mom, and using Nathan. The plan was to get Nathan to solicit on his behalf. He reasoned that Nathan, who was trying to win the favor of my family, would not deny his fiancé's father a request, but he was wrong. Nathan knew very well the ordeal my mom and I passed through at the hands of my father, and so he respectfully declined, because he loved the fact that my dad was getting a little bit of what he deserved, and he didn't want to get in on my family squabble without, quote, being invited. To pacify my father after declining his request to solicit on his behalf, he had to give him a little amount of money just to make him go away. And that's how he directed his attention towards Nathan, constantly bugging, requesting money from Nathan, sometimes gave while keeping the whole thing for me. I only learnt about it when Nathan could no longer deal with my father's disturbances. He saw firsthand what I have been trying to say all along. My father was a parasite who was always seeking a host to feed off of. Peacefully tried asking my dad to cut some slack, but as expected, my father pressed on further. Nathan finally got monetary peace when he threatened to obtain a restraining order against my dad from the police if he kept on disturbing and demanding money from him. Well, our lives resumed for the better. Even though I and my mom were very well taken care of by Nathan, I proceeded to get a really good job through Nathan's help. Because if I had learned anything from my mother's life, it's that one should try as much as possible not to be dependent on anyone. I needed to have my own stream of income just in case Nathan would change in the future. Well, he didn't, and he hasn't. 2 weeks into getting my new job, he asked that we get married. Of course, we were engaged already, but it seemed as though he either forgot the fact that he gave me a ring, which meant he would get married someday, or he just used it as means to announce to other guys that I was taken. Whatever it was, I didn't need to think or consider anything. I readily accepted. I was certain that no matter how bad Nathan became, Nathan could never be as bad as my father. Thankfully, things have just been better. The coming week saw everyone busy with preparations. 2 weeks to my day, I received word that my mother suffered a heart attack and was rushed to the hospital. A heart attack at 48 years of age. I can't remember how I got to the hospital, which was 2 miles away from me in less than 30 minutes, but I got there too late. My mom had passed on. I look back each year and the pain still fresh in my mind as it was a few years ago while I stood in front of her lifeless body at the hospital. A kind of emptiness of which a lack of words describe still reside inside me. I felt all alone. I felt regret, anger. A major reason someone of her age would suffer a heart attack is simply stress. Her workload had been reduced right from the time I began dating Nathan, but due to the fact that she had formed a habit of overworking herself, no thanks to my dad, she still overworked herself. She had not lived enough to reap the good fruits of her labor. All plans about the wedding came to a standstill. I found myself moving from making wedding preparations to planning my mother's own burial. It felt like a surreal, unreal dream. I was in great shock. I suffered a great deal from depression and needed time to heal. My wound was really deep, and I never thought I'd be able to heal and move on, but I did. Well, the void mom left in my heart still there, but things are a little bit better now. We finally had the wedding, fixed after we had put it off for a while. They say I was gorgeous, but I cared little about my appearance or countenance. My mother, who was to be by my side, was dead. And even though my father, who was to walk me to the altar, was still alive, he was dead to me. I was mourning on my wedding day. We were about exchanging our vows before the pastor when my father, the joy killer, gate-crashed my wedding. He began demanding that my fiancé repay all the money that he spent on child support before the wedding would proceed. It was always about the money. Not minding the emotional trauma I was going through as a result of having lost my mother, a matter which he never cared to send his condolence for, he chose to add to my grief, and rather than doing it on any other day, he chose my wedding day. The embarrassment was massive. The shame was going to be the talk of the town for weeks and months. Nathan's father's rich friends were all present, and it was obvious they were all appalled by my father's presence and display. I just wished the ground would open up and swallow me up, or maybe I could just open my eyes and figure out that I was all a terrible dream. It took everything in me to apply restraint on that day. If I had gone by my feelings, I would have physically attacked him then and there, and that would be the end of the wedding. Good enough. The security guards that were present quickly whisked my father away on Nathan's orders and my approval before detaining him at the police station till the wedding program was over. Throughout the rest of the day, I tried acting like nothing had happened, but no matter how hard I tried, I could not hide the fact that I've been embarrassed on my wedding day. I anxiously waited for the program to come to an end, and for the guests to leave so I can finally give my father the very thing that he's been seeking for all this time. And trust me, it was not going to be money. The day was over and the guests were gone, but our honeymoon was not really going to start soon. We drove to the station to see my father where he was being detained, and I descended on him without minding about what my husband and the police around me would think of this newly wedded bride. If my crappy father could choose my wedding day to tell the whole world that I was fathered by a messed up man, then I could care less if the whole universe saw me fighting my father on that day. I could not let the whole emotions out as Nathan and the cops on ground intervened quick. It was my father's lucky day. He would have paid for every ill treatment met by me and my mom. He was released to go, but I filed a restraining order and request to keep him out of my life forever. Weeks went by without me giving a thought about what had become of my father. What mattered was that I was enjoying my peace of mind. Though, at some point, news about him frequenting jail flew about. I didn't care what folks would say about me living comfortably, while my father did one brief jail time over the other petty crimes. Most of them were very much acquainted with the history of my father's escapades. He had lived his, quote, good life to the fullest without Mom and I, and so now I just want to live my life in peace, without having him in it. It was once a past he did not want associating with is just what he is to me. Nathan finally spoke to me about reaching out to him when I was pregnant with our third child. Nathan felt everyone deserved a second chance at life. While I didn't argue with my husband over giving people second chances, I knew for certain that my father had been given a second, third, fourth, even million chances at life, but he blew them all as he was going to blow whatever chance was thrown at him. He was not remorseful. He was not sorry for his mistakes. Yet the realization had not dawned on him yet that the path he was treading would lead him to spending the rest of his life alone. All he wanted was just a temporary fix to his problems, money for drinks, money for sex, money for pleasure, and I was certainly not going to reduce myself to that level. Nathan and I were now doing very well at our respective jobs, and besides Nathan's family's money, that was also at our disposal. We had more than enough to take care of my father, as Nathan suggested. I declined. Well, it was for two major reasons. He was not going to reap from where he did not sow. A large part of what I am today, I owe it to my mom, whom my father despised, and secondly, he was not a positive influence to me. Neither would he be to my kids, so placing him on a monthly allowance or bringing him over to live with us was a no-go for me. My father has laid his bed, so now he must lie on it. Actions have consequences. He should deal with it. My aim now is to focus on my family, my husband, my children. I'm pretty sure we're going to do just fine. It seems like everything OP tried to do, she could not get her father out of the picture. You would think once her mother passed away, that her father would just disappear into the night, finally giving her some peace. But once he got a whim of Nathan's rich lifestyle and parents' money, well, that was not going to stop the father from joining even harder. Guys, what I want to know from you, what would you do if you were in OP's position and this was happening to you? Drop your comments down below. Let's talk about it. Thank you so much for joining into today's video. I hope each and every one of you have an amazing day. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any more daily videos, and I'll catch you in the next one.